The title of this panel is on the value debate. Convergence, divergence, or compromise. Or conflict, rather than divergence, conflict, so using this 3C word. The topic of this panel really actually kind of teased out this morning, as if you attended this morning's session. I think Kishore Mahbubani and Wang Di both mentioned in different aspects. Kishore mentioned about this in the economic arena, the current crisis brought home the idea whether the Reagan economics is over, or is impact of the new sort of a free marketeer type of economy is over. This is a debate. And Wang Di mentioned about nationalism as a rising sort of value system in certain part of the world, including China. So this is not a recent debate. Debate is old. Value debate is very old in both international affairs and public affairs. I think many of us agree that ideas matter. Value being a set of ideas and guiding principles that a large population accept, I think matters a lot in public policy. Again, germane to our field here. I think in public policy, the focus of so-called value system or value debate on probably three aspects, if I may summarize. The role of the state or government, the role of the market and private sector, and finally, the role of citizen and civil society or society. I think those are three kind of areas that this debate may engage involved. And specifically, we'll ask today, we can tease out some of the debate today and different aspects, different answers, that what are these different value systems? What are these different value systems, on this different, aspects of this debate? Role of the state, role of the society, role of the market, or the private sector. And are they diverging or converging? What are they? Are they converging? So are we seeing a kind of moving towards some sort of a more or less accepted value system or not, worldwide? If they are, towards what? Right? And finally, should there be a convergence? Should there be just a more colorful world? This last question reminds me of an article that many of you have read. This is published in early 1990. I think it was 1990 by the thinker, political scientist Fukuyama, Francis Fukuyama. The famous title is "The End of the History." If you recall that in that article, basically Fukuyama author mentioned that while celebrating the advance of democracy, by the end of the Cold War, he also bemoans a kind of colorless world that's hence afterward. The world basically is won by capitalism, by democracy. And then the world will basically become colorless. No more other kind of competing value system will there be. Boy, even himself realized that's not the case. As many of you read his recent books and will realize. So it'll be interesting. It's a thought-provoking concept, the value debate. Again, I think that even though there's an old, long-existing debate, I think most recent decades, especially most recent years, has made this issue again more salient and prominent. One could cite the fact of globalization, with a more and more flow of ideas, transmission of ideas, personnel, goods. And also the economic crisis, most recently the economic crisis. As we know now, some people began to question, if not challenge, the American model of free market, right? And then that's again, this is being played out. And also, I would say another factor is the emergence of China and India. Also provide some kind of intriguing question. In political sciences, whether there is something called authoritarian resilience. This is also a debate in my field of political science. And the economics, of course, is the debate between the more neoliberal market, free market theorists, and more sort of a post-Keynesian or Keynesian type of economist. And now, of course, with the current economic crisis, I assume this debate will become even more heated. Then international relations, I don't have to say much about, liberalism, which focus a lot on the value system, on ethics, versus realism, which is much more focused on the realpolitik, and more recently the neoconservatism as a new kind of concept. especially in the matter of foreign policy. Now, in politics and in society and public administration, there are questions about debate about democracy versus rule of law. One of our panelists is actually quite active, has been quite active, well known in such debate in China, Professor Pan, and also debate over small government, the idea of small government in politics or in public administration, the universality of human rights, nationalism versus internationalism, and conflicts between modernity and postmodernism, and the list goes on and on. But today, I mean, we know that there are so many different aspects of values that could be debated, even as related to public policy. But today, we have 4 distinguished panelists, and if you look at the background, it's quite diversified. It shows you that you probably will hear remarks from different aspects. We'll have one practitioner, Hannah Rixi, who's the head of UNICEF in China, and we also have Professor of Political Science and Public Policy, and Kirsten Grunberg, who is an expert on NGO and philanthropy. She's heading a center, a very famous center of NGO studies at Indiana University. And then the 2 professors from Peking University. One is a political philosopher, Professor Li, and the other one is a comparative politics specialist, Professor Pan. So without further ado, I will invite them to speak about 10 minutes maximum, and then we'll move to questions and debate. And first is Hannah.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. And the case that I would like to present and discuss is the case of global values after a national disaster. And I will use the example of the post-earthquake reconstruction in China this year as an example of convergence in values, but also as an example of challenges in the implementation and acting upon values in policy implementation. So first, let's highlight a few global values that relate to post-disaster reconstruction. Of course, number 1 is to protect lives and health of people. Number 2, we can say, is to put children and other vulnerable groups first. Number 3, it is to restore basic social services. And number 4, it is to restore people's livelihood. We can also suggest 2 important values in terms of the approach, and that is transparency and accountability and citizens' participation. Now, in acting upon these global values, international experience has suggested that what is very important and where there is a very important role for the state to play is to establish basic social services and ensure that all people can use these services according to their needs. And here the lesson has been that one has to go much beyond physical reconstruction, that one needs to address human resources, the funding channels, quality management, and many other institutional challenges as well as financing challenges. Another important lesson from the international experience has been that central coordination at the government level is extremely important in post-disaster reconstruction, and particular need to accept policies that cut across sectors, so integrated approach across sectors. A very important lesson from many disasters that we can see is that the newly built facilities will benefit those in need and will make services, public services, accessible to those in need, only if certain criteria are met. Now, one can suggest 6 criteria. 1, the rights of citizens and the obligations of service providers and government need to be clearly defined and enforced. 2, funding for essential services needs to be adequate and also appropriately allocated and channeled through the government and non-governmental systems. 3, any service fees or unfair charges that disqualify the poor from public services and public goods need to be abolished or appropriately regulated. 4, adequate mechanisms for quality, equity, and accountability in service delivery need to be established. Fifth, the past inadequacies of facilities and services need to be recognized and overcome during reconstruction. And finally, that local governments need to work closely with citizens. So these are the lessons from, the highlighted lessons from international experience as related to post-disaster reconstruction. And now let's have a look at the experience of China during the past months, since May this year, during the post-earthquake reconstruction. First, when we look at the early actions that the government took during the May to August, the first phase of reconstruction, we can see that there has been an unprecedented effort to protect human lives. And many Chinese intellectuals have debated and agreed that this was the first time in Chinese history that human lives have been put on the first place. Secondly, with respect to coordinated and cross-sectoral approach, it is interesting to note that the government established 9 cross-sectoral ministerial groups that worked under the State Council. And one of them, which was in charge of developing the post-earthquake reconstruction strategy and was led by the National Development and Reform Commission, included 30 ministries and core agencies. Now, when we look at the master plan, which was master plan for reconstruction, which was submitted for public debate in August, and now the final version has been available earlier this month, we can see that some of the strengths of this plan relate to the global values, that people and people's needs are really put on the first place, is conceptually. And we can see that there is a conceptual emphasis on essential public services, on equity, and on support to vulnerable groups, including national minorities. But we can also see that there are certain weaknesses in the reconstruction plan, and that these weaknesses mainly relate to implementation. We can see that the plan mainly focuses on physical reconstruction, on building new facilities for the delivery of public services. And we can see that there is much less that is needed on the institutional underpinnings, such as financing and governance for the delivery of public services. We can also suggest that China is facing a double challenge at this moment. One is the challenge of formulating and implementing key reforms, such as the health system reform, which is now under debate and submitted for public opinion, and the challenge of reconstruction. And one can see that there is not yet sufficient convergence between the reconstruction plan and, for instance, the health system reform plan. Now, third, with respect to further challenges and opportunities for reconstruction in China, we can see that there is a great need to act more energetically on social protection and assistance to the poor to ensure that basic social services are affordable for all population groups, all households. And one can emphasize also that there is a great scope for innovative approaches and linking innovative approaches with the local traditions that have been in place. And here I would suggest that the healthcare system is one area where innovative approaches now could be started and could be implemented in the earthquake-affected localities as a way to pilot some of the health system reform approaches that have been proposed. Now, if I discuss a little bit more the reconstruction of the healthcare system as an example in the context of nationwide reform, when we look at public health, we can see that basic public health services have been fully financed and delivered immediately after the earthquake in earthquake-affected localities. Of course, this is not the case nationwide, but it is one of the objectives of the currently proposed health system reform. With respect to essential clinical care, We can see, of course, great need for essential clinical care in the earthquake-affected localities, but we can also see in the health system reform plan how complex it is to develop institutional and financing mechanisms, incentive and accountability mechanisms to ensure that the essential clinical care is delivered on a basis of cost effectiveness and fairness and according to the need to the entire population. So one could again argue that perhaps some of the earthquake-affected localities might be appropriate pilots to test some of the innovative approaches. And of course, universal coverage. Universal coverage of essential health services is the key objective of the current health system reform plan of the government. And achieving universal coverage in the earthquake-affected provinces may serve as a model and facilitate universal coverage countrywide. Now, with respect to these challenges in building upon global values and realizing global values in policy implementation, one could identify a great scope for collaboration between practitioners, policy schools, and international agencies such as, for instance, UNICEF. And I would like to suggest 5 possible areas based on my experience in China, which is now more than 7 years, and based on research. So number 1, based on international experience and on local needs and local traditions and the local systems, how to define clearly what are the responsibilities of the central government. This is a major question in China across sectors, starting with the health system, where the discussion is now underway and cutting across all the sectors. Number 2, and perhaps even more challenging question is how to define the role and accountability of provinces. Provincial governments are primarily responsible for policy implementation, but the incentives to implement policies have not been clearly defined, and accountability for enforcing laws, for implementing policy, for encouraging equity within provinces. These accountability mechanisms have not been in place. So we see greater problems, in fact, within provinces than across provinces, greater inequities within provinces than across provinces. 4, the issue of accountability of service providers. How to develop a mechanism through which service providers would be accountable for equity and for quality of the services they provide. 4, performance management system, particularly for providers and for subnational governments. In the context of the political, economic, and social system in China, how to develop an effective performance management system that would create the right incentives for instance, compliance with national policies and standards. And finally, of course, the issue of citizens' participation. And in this context, there have been a lot of interesting pilots, interesting experiments done in China, including a citizens' scorecard survey, which was exploring how citizens have been happy and what the experiences have been in access to essential public services across sectors. So building on these initiatives and developing a national system through which citizens could provide feedback and directly contribute into monitoring of policy implementation and into policy evaluation. That's an urgent priority which would benefit greatly from the contribution of researchers. Now, bottom line for my presentation is that, number 1, China's post-earthquake reconstruction has become a good case of convergence to the global values. But number 2, that there are major complex challenges on how to implement values, how to build upon values, how to implement the policies that have been formulated according to the values. So this would be the area in which I believe that greater collaboration among researchers, public policy schools, and practitioners would be very beneficial. Thank you.
Thank you very much for allowing me to participate in this conference. It's a great honor to be here, and I found the discussion very interesting and very, very helpful. The focus on global values debate might seem like a softer topic than what we have talked about so far today. But I think it is also clear that underlying much of the discussion that we have heard about the environment and economic growth and development, about the financial architecture, focusing specifically on the role of government and market organizations, very much touched on and are tied together by system of values and what people believe are the right ways of doing things, including bordering it on ideology in a more formulaic sense. Clearly also the discussion of governance, bringing in issues about legitimacy and participation, cooperation of multiple interest groups means that unless there is some common understanding of what the issues are and what we are striving towards, those developments will simply not be very successful. I have chosen to focus my topic on the role that nonprofit organizations, civil society organizations, NGOs, whatever you want to call them, they go by different names and different structures. The role that they play in structuring core social values. And I want to start by just a little bit of an overview from the World Values Survey that has been conducted now since 1981 in roughly 4 wages, more than 80 countries, where a very similar survey has been delivered to samples of, I guess, a minimum of 1,000 people across 6 continents, focusing on a broad array of values from religion, community, politics, economic life, social life, family life, and where the analysis, and I'm drawing here on work by Engelhardt and Welsel in a recent series of publications, argue that these values, as you look at these 80 different countries or societies, array themselves along 2 major dimensions. Traditional versus secular, rational authority values, and survival versus self-expression values. And looking at those, using those 2 dimensions, arguing that societies, as examined in these surveys, cluster into 8 or 10 different clusters, depending a little bit on how you define your groupings, that is characterized by economic development on the one hand, by religious traditions on the other hand, and by history of centrally planned economies. And so you can see we are picking up on a number of issues that we have already talked about today. Implicit in that description and analysis is a theory of value change, that as societies transition from survival to industrialized economies, there is a corresponding shift from traditional to secular values. As they transition from industrial to knowledge economies, there is a corresponding shift from survival to self-expression values. And that seems to me leave us with at least 2 major scenarios. Assuming that in fact will happen, economies undergo these expected transitions, we should see future convergence of the core values. On the other hand, it is not by any means clear that all economies, all societies are undergoing those transitions, certainly not in the same time frame, and that there are likely to be both stagnation and reversals, that we may be entering a period of reversal. Right now we don't know quite how severe that's going to be, but that would clearly suggest growing differences in core values, and probably also greater efforts to cloak aspirations for power, for resources, for security, and for expansion in terms of values. And I want to remind you that there's an overlay of religious traditions and role of government in the configuration, the clustering of values. In either case, I would argue non-profits, civil society organizations will play a pivotal role in framing these value debates. That's the case because to the extent that you have civil society organizations, formalized at least, they are mechanisms by which people play out or formalize substantive goals. The missions of these organizations, the purposes of these organizations, in a sense, are enacted values. They are the values expressed by a particular segment of that society. But it's not really a very simple calculus at all, because we also know from work that has been done on these organizations, civil society organizations, that societies differ in the configuration of these organizations. Certainly they differ in the centrality of religious institutions. Some societies have state religions, others have had some level of hostility towards religion. They differ in how non-profits relate to government, in a form of financial relations, political relations. They differ in the capacities and configurations of the organizations themselves. We have a variety of work that points to those kinds of differences. And they differ also in the nature of involvement that people, individuals have in these organizations, and the trust that people have in them. And that means, I think, that to some extent the conflicts over values will most likely be shaped by the ideologies, the resources, the service capacities, and the networks that these organizations themselves possess and are able to carry or able to manifest. Obviously, it will also depend on the resources, ideologies, and networks of a whole series of global actors, not just within these societies. The U.S. military, the United Nations, World Bank, OPEC, multinational corporations, international relief agencies, transnational advocacy organizations, etc. These all play very important roles, and we have work that documents that as well. But there is, I think, for policy schools, a number of significant challenges and opportunities. There is, for one thing, a very significant research gap. Most of the current work focusing on civil society organizations have looked at the role that these organizations play in the economy and in the service delivery systems. And to some extent also, and I think increasingly, on the role that they play as opportunities for civic engagement. But we don't know very much about how they actually go about shaping ideologies and values. And I think if we had a better understanding of that, we would have a better understanding of the configuration of values as they manifest themselves in these world value surveys. We would have a better understanding of how values change and spread within or across societies, and how values play into power relations. This is not going to be easy work to do. It will be difficult because it means we will have to map organizational values, what these organizations say and don't say about what is important and why they exist. we will also have to determine how they work to promote or undermine particular values, that is, what they actually do. And you can think about this in terms of offensive strategies, the way in which they seek to undermine the facts and arguments of adversaries, intimidate or embarrass their adversaries, delegitimize adversaries or rival institutions, strip adversaries of moderates, enlarge their own alliances. This is all kind of common politics types of strategies. Defensive strategies, cloak rhetoric in positive symbols, borrow glory from white knights, and refrain from inciting adversaries. And there's a number of other strategies you can think about. Sensitive, I think, and difficult in that sense also, because values do align with major social cleavages. There's class differences, religious differences, race, ethnicity, gender, urban-rural differences. And that means that you also inevitably talk about power relationships and differences in power. I think where policy schools can make a very significant contribution is to begin a more systematic examination of how these values from the World Value Survey align with missions and values of the full range of non-profit, civil society, NGOs in a given society. How non-profit values relate to the resources that they control. Some of them are controlling significant more resources than others. And those resources include linkages to government, linkages to market organizations, to religious institutions, to transnational institutions. And how effective they are in promoting particular values, this mix of defensive and offensive strategies, the effective use of symbols. And I don't know the extent to which what we teach our students really thoroughly examine the configurations of values and how they align with substantive policy issues and power relations. And I think that is a very significant role for us to give to seasoned practitioners who have had the experience of negotiating among conflicting groups and know the understand the significance of the give and take and the importance of compromises and developing collaborative approaches. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to speak in this conference. It's my great pleasure to speak. And my talk is rather more abstract because as the moderator introduced, I myself as a political philosopher, and so I will try to say something to philosophically reflect on the issue of universal values. I think one of the key issues in contemporary political philosophy or public philosophy is the issue of universalism versus particularism. The question is, are there any universal moral and political values by which one can evaluate moral and political behaviors? The holders of universalism, liberals and new conservatives alike, would have no hesitation to claim the existence of certain universally valid values, which form the foundation for evaluating political institutions and actions. The universal values in our minds are mainly values as developed since the Enlightenment movement in the West. The core values mainly include human rights, individual liberty, democracy, rule of law, and etc. In contrast to this universalism, some people, particularly non-Western people, may emphasize the values as developed in various cultural traditions. For instance, there have been arguments that the Asian values, or in China's case, Confucian values, are more suitable for Asian societies. As my opinion, that both universalism and particularism have limitations. Universalism tends to define universal values based on values in the modern West. Thus, that in practice, treat particular values in particular locality at a particular time as universalism. Particularism associates moral and political values mainly or even exclusively with particular cultural traditions, and thus deny the common nature of the mankind and undermine the human capacity of rational thinking in moral and political issues. Addressing the problem of both universalism and particularism, some prominent Western philosophers have tried to find a middle way. John Rawls, for instance, a renowned philosopher, suggests that there are some overlapping consensus one could find from all major cultural and religious traditions. This overlapping consensus could be treated as a minimum normative rules to guide the international moral and political actions. While Rawls' notion of overlapping consensus is helpful to solve the problem of universalism and particularism, it leaves some important questions unanswered. What are the contents of this overlapping consensus? Who should make judgment? For instance, do human rights and democracy belong to this overlapping consensus? Why? I would like to go further than Rawls. I will go back to the classical Greek philosophy to find some wisdom to answer these questions. Following the methodology of Aristotle, the starting point starting point for study of moral and political values is to analyze existing value system, which are value system. For in all political societies would develop a particular value system which are essential for forming and sustaining a political community, be it a Greek city-state, a Chinese empire, or Western nation-state. Theoretically, political values in various political societies are just opinions, in Plato's term, opinions, Plato's contrast between opinions and knowledge. No particular political values, no matter whether it develops from the West or from China, could claim to be the knowledge, again in Plato's term. Yet, political values in various political societies all contain to a different degree some elements of knowledge. There is no doubt existing of universal mankind and thus existing of universal knowledge. Nevertheless, universal mankind is not a society existing in the world, but a symbol that indicates man's consciousness of participating in his earthly existence in the mystery of a reality that moves towards transfiguration. Okay. What is the significance of classical ideas for understanding the issue of universalism? I think the proper interpretation of Plato may shed light to us. And for Plato, there are different levels of knowledge. The highest level of knowledge is the being as self, I think that the true universal values, of course, this is the being itself, for Plato is some unspeakable and unreachable truth. Every society should always keep the spirit of self-reflection on their own culture to try to approach these universal values. Self-reflection, I think, is the key word here, both for political and also for my argument. For instance, because in China, in the last several months, there have been a lot of debates about on the issue of universal values and China's particular cultures. I think, for instance, for China's case, I would make an argument that China, of course, has a long political tradition. Political values in traditional China have been essential in evoking the existence of a Chinese political society and in creating order. One should not simply reject it and hope to replace it with some abstract principles. Yet, one should always keep in mind that those political values are only opinions. Chinese society, as all other societies, is obliged to transcend current existence and pursue universal truths. The universal mankind or the being itself is knowable only through good natured soul. This is a Plato's notion. You cannot know it, but you can only reflect it through the good natured soul. China should always try to turn its soul to the true being and use its best understanding of the true knowledge, true being, to reevaluate the current political ideas and practices. In pursuing the true being, knowledge of other cultures, of course, certainly are helpful. And it might be the case that some other cultures, in their pursuing universal humanity, may have gone further than China and have found more truths than Chinese have done. For instance, it could be argued that some modern values, such as liberty, democracy, and human rights, are not the particular values associated with modern wealth. They contain elements of the truth. Nevertheless, it would be naive to suggest that China should follow those principles simply because they are the truth. The correct way is to seriously reflect its own tradition, to sincerely reflect the more important elements in other traditions, and then to tune, I think, again, use Plato's word, to tune its own soul to the good nature and pursue its own way to move towards the truth. Thank you very much.
China has come back to the world stage. It seems that China has conflicts with the West, materialists. But in my opinion, materialistic conflicts are easy to resolve. Well, the ideational conflict might not be that easy. And as when we talk about global values, convergence or divergence, we're actually picking among the world's ideological fashions. And right now, well, I want to make 3 points. Number one is that introducing the current status quo on Chinese values situation about the debate. And number 2 is about what are the conflicts with the West in terms of values. And number 3, on the proposed conflict resolution. And now the first point, that is the status quo. And I think right now, China has this mainstream value, or let's say media mainstream, or scholarly mainstream. That is to say, today's West is tomorrow's China. And that is to say, the China will be or is a stakeholder of the whole world system led by the West. And but then today's mainstream, it will not be tomorrow's mainstream. Why? Because let's talk about briefly described history. China in modern times has experienced three kinds of crossroads, or three decades. One is 1919. when China was at the crossroads, whether going to the republic or going to the monarchy. And then in 1949, when the People's Republic of China was built, China was again at the crossroads, picking up the mainstream values, whether communist or going to a so-called democratism. And in 1979, China was at the crossroads, so China chose the opening and reform. And in 2009, next year, again, the third decade, after 3 decades of reform and opening, China will be at the crossroads again, and choosing, wondering where China will go. A huge debate, I could predict, is going to start. And then I could roughly predict that maybe 15 years later, the mainstream, the new mainstream might not be the Western two schools, whether it's liberal democracy or socialism, communism, but will be a China school or China model as a value system. I think it is fairly safe to say that. And second point, the value conflicts are mainly street with the West when China has come back to the global stage. Number one might be liberty, the concept, very fuzzy concept. Then in China, we might want to ask the state-society dichotomy is problematic, and liberty, whose liberty? Capitals or humans. And it is whether it should be the capital captures the state. This is a model that we clearly see in the West. Or the state captures the capital. We clearly see that in China. And second might be democracy. And then we might say democracy, autocracy, autonomy, dichotomy may even be considered as a kind of obscurantism, like the dichotomy between Christians and pagans during the time of the Crusade. Even Aristotle described 6 types of political systems among the ancient Greek city-states. I personally would describe the Chinese polity as a kind of a meritocracy instead of either democracy or autocracy. And the third difference might be that many Chinese may feel difficult to understand the Western logic. That is, if you don't look like us, you must be a threat to us. And thus we have a vital stake in converting you in terms of values. Chinese is the only nation in the world that does not use an alphabetical system for writing. We don't feel that it's a threat to any other nation. And we have no intention to spread the Chinese written system to replace the alphabetical system of any other nation. So once we see this kind of 3 kinds of conflicts, we might find solutions, conflict resolutions. I would propose 3 or describe the 3. First, the Chinese model is a problem-solving model of pragmatism, which is not based on a systematic set of ideas like the Soviet model, as it does not declare universality. It is by nature not confrontational to any ideological system. In fact, nowhere is there an agreement on what the China model is. Chinese have been a secularized people for nearly 3,000 years. We don't let the God guide us. We want to see whether the God could solve our problems. We want to learn from all, inviting all kinds of ideas into China, be it communism or capitalism, be it liberalism or conservatism. Unlike the Soviet ideology, the Chinese pragmatism is hardly an enemy to the Western ideology, although it might be a challenge to ideologues. Second, the pragmatic Chinese dislike the ideational conflict, confrontation. Some would say democracy is a good thing, and they want democracy. But what they really care might be how to curb corruption. Anything that could effectively curb corruption is called a democracy. And some Chinese would say liberty is a good thing, and they want liberty and human rights. But what they really care might be how to improve the government's accountability. Anything that could improve the government's Chinese what exactly you mean by democracy or liberty, they would say, thank you very much for enlightening us, and proceed with their own agenda of democracy or liberty. Ideas might be contradictory, but life has to go on, and life is a priority. We want to keep good relations with all others and learn from all others for solving our own immediate problems in life. But the third resolution, conflict resolution, might be more problematic. That is, the most difficult thing is a mixture of strategic and ideological conflict between China and the West. If we say the ideological, if the strategic intentions could be clarified with strategic dialogues and boundaries of interests could be defined through negotiations with spirit of compromise. But once strategic bargaining is covered with ideological wrappings, things would become a lot more complicated. This is to say, once the materialistic interests and mediational factors are intermingled, defining strategic interests will become extremely difficult. The mixture of the two, by mutually intensifying each other, would obtain a life of its own and necessarily create a negative spiral for worsening conflicts between China and the West. And with the so-called strategic vision, some Western elites intend to build a transatlantic holy alliance of values against China, condemning China with violation of universal values such as democracy with regard to popularly electing top leaders or liberty of free this or free that in the name of human rights. The wisdom is that if you can't defeat them, you can confuse them. It appears like an old strategy in dealing with the Soviet Union in Helsinki Treaty of August 1st, 1973, for example. Once the Russian intellectuals were converted by the Western value system, the Soviet regime fell apart and human disasters occurred. Then the previous human rights activists suddenly disappeared. This strategy worked in dealing with the Soviet Union, but it is dangerous in dealing with China, although some Chinese elites are already converted or confused. Once Chinese see the strategic intentions behind the spread of the Western ideology, they would also have difficulty in rationally defining the Chinese strategic interests, leading to the negative spiral of hostility. In short, this mixture could well mess up our cooperative relationship. So we should separate the two. However, it's extremely difficult. Thank you very much.
Well, as promised, this is meant to be a thought-provoking and debate-provoking panel. So, if I may, start the discussion here. My first question I would like to ask Kirsten. Given what Professor Lee talked about, the sort of debate between the universality versus sort of the particularism in terms of world values, I wonder, you talk about, your main focus is on the framing of the debate by NGOs, that's how values are generated, with a particular focus on the NGO's role. I wonder NGO's role in this, given the kind of universalism versus particularism, and when NGO become a framer of the debate, does it have a tendency to be kind of one side or the other, or promote a certain value system than other, or promotes more diversified, promotes different kinds of values? So I wonder, for example, naturally people think, this again from a non-expert point of view, that an NGO is something in a society point of view. Then it will promote something of a small state, of a less role of a state, more role of a society. So is that how that can you explain a little bit in that sense?
civil society organizations occur at all scales of society, from small communities to the transnational level. The Red Cross is one of those examples. Doctors Without Borders are well-known international relief organizations. There are any number of those. Gun control spans international boundaries. So I think my response to you is that you will find organizations involved in shaping, expressing values at any one level. They're not going to necessarily be consistent. Certainly we see that in the US, where we have very active debates, pro and con specific issues. That's what I'm most familiar with, but certainly you see in a number of other societies as well. And I think the extent to which the configuration of values in the World Values Survey do align with religious traditions. I think that's a very important driving force. Do align with kind of government philosophy. That also is clearly a very driving factor that suggests that it is potentially changeable. If you take your 30-year transformation of China, that has seen significant shifts in the government structure, so that we would expect some alignment along those. But clearly, I think the civil society organizations are one of the mechanisms by which these debates are carried out, and they occur among these organizations. They occur to some extent within the organizations as they make decisions about where they want to go. But it's also important to recognize that they have different resources. And in part, those resources are going to be important in determining how that value debate plays itself out. That's why I think it is important not only to look at what the values are, but what are the resources that these organizations bring to bear. Access to media, access to government, access to other important institutions.
Question from audience? Perhaps one there, and then, yes, first there, and then before, and then.
Thank you. My name is Han. I'm Cherry. The day before yesterday, I was watching the BBC. An interesting debate on the Hard Talk was a representative of the Evangelical Church in the United States. And he was saying that he is representing the American values, vis-a-vis the values represented by the Obama camp, who does not represent the American values. And of course, there's a lot of contradictions. What exactly the American values? I followed the discussion, and of course, I get more confused. Now, we are talking about universal values. And are we talking about disseminating deliberate policy action to establish a set of universal values vis-a-vis the prevailing values? Or are we talking about a move that's aware of the discrepancies, the differences, the stages of development, whatever it is that's used to explain the change of values? So they can coexist. And whether we like it or not, history teaches us that countries, civilizations, whatever it is, nations, by more interaction, they borrow values as well as, or import values as well as export values. Now, if we follow the first track, which sometimes appears to be the intention or the agenda, at least it's what assumed to be the agenda behind many of the movement to establish universal values. Whose values? I started by the example of the hard talk thing, which was repeated 3 times. To say, if you are going to say, for example, the American values, what are the American values? And if these are the universal values, or we say there are common values between the American culture and European culture, and as someone who experiences both, I would beg to say there are differences, but if we say these are the Western values, there are more than half the world. If you talk about China, if you talk about the Muslim world, if you talk about substantial parts of Africa, I think all of us, we have a totally different value system. And it has shaped many of our actions, beliefs, policies, organization, and so on. So which values are we going to? Is it the values of the victorious? Or should we concentrate more on what can be common? And there are human common values. I think if we devote more time trying to dig out these and let people of China choose whatever they like, and then we try to explain, discuss, involve, engage in discussions and so on and explanation. And let the things flourish, again using the, I hope I'm not mistaken, the famous now expression, let 1,000 flowers blossom. I think if we have this, we are moving into more practical grounds, where we can have more common things, that we can harmonize the different value systems that exist, and they do change as have been explained, and they have reversals and advances and so on. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. If this is meant to be a comment, I'll just leave it as it is, but I just quickly react to your comment. I think it's very interesting. If you paid attention to the presentation so far, the last three panels, there are actually 2 points I thought kind of teased out as quote-unquote universalized or universal. Whether it is, we can debate it. One is someone, I think our Indian colleague said, growth is uncompromised. What is it? It's beyond debate. That's interesting. He made a simple point. I thought it was very interesting. Is growth the kind of beyond debate? Everybody wants growth, right? That's sort of like a system that kind of universal. Okay. The other one is a Japanese colleague this morning mentioned. Tanaka-san mentioned democracy. Something about democracy is good. Democracy. This is also the kind of also more or less accepted by the world. But then your question is, or challenge is, what democracy? Let's ask, what democracy? Is democracy everybody's same? Right? I mean, I think those are, I just want to make a quick comment on those observations. Anyone want to respond to that? No? Okay. Kishore?
Thank you. I thought that the last presentation by Professor Pan Wei was really brilliant. I think it's given us a lot to reflect on. And there are 2 things I wonder whether they can develop further. The first one, of course, I think he conveys very well the Chinese view that by being pragmatic and non-ideological, China can avoid a conflict with the West. But frankly, as he himself said, China's rise as a non-democracy threatens the West. So in that sense, I wonder whether China has any kind of long-term strategy to try and reduce the Western alarm about the rise of China. And here the second point is that, this morning Professor Wang Jixi made a very surprising comment. He said, China is not worried about McCain's idea of a League of Democracies. Frankly, China should be worried. Because if you have a League of Democracies, the only major country in the world excluded from the League of Democracies will be China. India will be included, Russia will be included, Brazil will be included, but China will not be included. So I'm sure that this is in one way or another an ideological response to the rise of China. So my question is, what would China's response be to this ideological challenge?
This is really a question I'm full of no answer. Really, I noticed your article on the newspaper, and that made me bored. And one way to think about that is that China model would not spread. just like Chinese language, written language. And then the entire Western camp has to live with that. And this is a fact, whether it's perceived as a threat or not. And if it's perceived as a threat, it's extremely dangerous. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if it's not, actually, China is not a threat.
Yes, gentleman in the middle.
Yes, my name is Jorge Jaime. I would like to follow up with a similar question to the one that was posed now to Professor Pan Wei as well. I would like to move to another level. One level is the level of values, and from the presentation of Professor Pan Wei, one could see the obvious differences between values in the West, values in China. Yet, if we move from the level of the actual behavior within the international system, most observers would say that today China is playing a very constructive role. It is not seen as a revisionist power in the West, or by most observers. And therefore, the question of the threat at the level of values is something, to my mind, rather remote and abstract. That, to the contrary, in terms of actual behavior, China is playing a very constructive role. For some observers in the West, the real threat might come from Russia, that is seen as threatening and revisionist, whereas China is playing a very different role. I would wonder if you would care to elaborate a bit on that.
Yes, I think actually it's not conflictive with China's behavior. It's not really conflictive with China's value system. And China behaves pretty well, and so the value actually is pretty well. But actually it is the value system in the West that has problem. The dichotomy, like democracy, autocracy, is really offensive, alienating so many nations. So it is the Western's enclosure of mind, I guess, particularly I call it obscurantism, so that creates so many enemies. And also the state-society dichotomy. In China, we see the state-society mutually penetrating. And it could be another model. So that I would say, yes, China would like to make a constructive role in the international system. That's true. But China is not a stakeholder in terms of invading Iraq or occupation of Iraq or Afghanistan. China is not a stakeholder in terms of Wall Street's wild play. And it turns out it's a disaster for both the world and the American people.
Any questions? Yes, boy.
First, I'd like to make 2 comments and then just ask 1 question. I'm Hui from Shanghai Jiao University School of International and Public Affairs. This morning we had a topic, panel 1 topic is the future of global governance, balancing legitimacy and efficacy. I think we just change the topic. The future of China's governance, balancing legitimacy and efficacy. Because in China, in past 3 decades, we experienced rapid economic growth. And China's GDP currently, I think this year we will rank number 3 in the world. So as for the efficacy, we just made a great achievement. But the problem is we confront the problem of legitimacy. How to address these? I think some universal values is very important, including democracy and human rights. So I think today is a time to discuss the values of China. That's a more important thing. And the second, if we're just talking about the values, I think any country should be a combination between the universalism and the particularism. No country can just have particularism without universalism. If in the Western democracies, we just look at the United States and the United Kingdom, they have different forms of government. United States just has the presidential government, and the Kingdom just have the government, parliamentary government. So they are democracy, but they also have some particular forms of government. So nobody can deny the particularism, but they should have universalism. So I think we should not debate either particularism or universalism. We should balance these two, I think, particularism and universalism. And finally, I just asked a question to Professor Pan Wei. You just mentioned there will be a China model. I want to know, what's the meaning of China model? What's the main value of that model? Thank you.
You want to answer that?
Well, China model is not value-laden, as I just said. It's a model of pragmatism. And also, I noticed that you're a supporter of universal value, but I believe that your universal value actually is Western. And I think certainly I agree there is a universal value principle, human, but moral. We are all the same. We share the same moral principle as humankind. No killing, no stealing, no lying, and so on. But labeling certain political value as universal, I think it is part of Western tradition, a tradition of absolutism and a lack of tolerance. And as to you mentioned this Chinese government's legitimacy problem, I think it is a fabricated one. And as you know, if you say electoral majority principle means legitimacy, then Thailand has given you the answer. The minority will not admit laws. If that could gain you, the majority principle could gain you legitimacy, the whole world would be in total peace. There will be no political chaos anymore. So that is nonsense. Sorry.
Last question. Yes.
I don't need a mic. You've been talking a lot of values.
No, I think you better use it.
Oh. I'm sorry to bother you again with another question, but say I live in a room and there is some noise in the next door, and my neighbor is being hurt. Then I think it's my right to go and see what's happening in that room. And if there's some mistake somebody is doing, I think I have each and every right to say, I think you're making a mistake, you shouldn't be doing that. If that was the real responsibility of China, I would personally say that it would not be giving billions of dollars to so many nations in Africa, as well as it would have changed its policy towards Tibet. So what kind of value is China creating? Is it the value of pragmatism? Is it the value of pragmatism, this policy towards Tibet as well as Africa? How do you answer what kind of value that? I'd appreciate if you answer that.
I didn't quite get you. Yeah, you were using the neighbor, so basically you're saying that China threw dollars to Africa with a pragmatic...
Is that a pragmatic value, China's policy towards actually diminishing countries like Tibet? Like, the riots, control of riots, that has been in media all over the last 3 months. Or as aiding the government of Sudan that has been killing so many of its own citizens. Is that practical? Is that pragmatism? I just was just a little curious.
Care to comment? Anyone?
Well, we don't compare Tibet with Sudan. That's one point. And we know who stirred up those troubles in Tibet. And we know who stirred up the trouble in Sudan. Chinese government has not made it worse. I think if you study very carefully, I think this allegement will not stand.
Well, with that note, you obviously, we'll have. I think we have to end here because I know that we have many questions. The debate goes on. Obviously, I don't think anyone would draw any conclusion to this debate. That shows you the importance of the topic, and the values debate goes on, and it goes within country among different scholars and policymakers, and between nations among nations. So I think debate is a good thing. And with that note, I want to thank all our panelists for their presentation discussion. And I think I want to invite Howard Davies and Richard to come up and to conclude this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to be quite brief since it's been a long day and we are already a little bit over time. I just wanted to, however, say a couple of words about the overall initiative that we are engaged in, and one about one specific future dimension of it. When we set up the GPTA, our view at the LSE, and I think this vision was shared by our partners at Xiaobo, Columbia, now Lee Kuan Yew School, and I think at Peking University as well, was that there was an interesting space to occupy in the field of global governance, that there were issues which were clearly requiring a set of collective actions internationally, which required imaginative thinking about the kind of structures that you put in place to reach the policies that were necessary, that there was an interesting moment in the world going on with a shift in the balance of economic power and possibly also geopolitical power, and that there was an interesting territory in the area of global governance which we could fruitfully explore together. Furthermore, that it was almost inherent in the nature of that territory that to do so from the perspective of one institution in one particular part of the world was almost certainly not the approach to take, and that you needed a global academic network to relate to the scale and the breadth of the problems in global governance that we were trying to face. I think that today's discussions have shown to me that this hypothesis that there was this territory and that it was very interesting and that we could make a contribution to it is borne out. And I think that the environmental debate, which can only be a global debate and which requires new thinking about the nature of international agreements and the nature of bodies that might oversee those agreements, that's one clear example. And in the more tedious territory which I have traditionally occupied of global financial markets, which have generated their own little excitements recently, that there's clearly a set of intriguing issues there where thinking about how to balance national sovereignty, which is likely to remain an important building block in financial market regulation, because financial market regulation is about property rights and is sensitive to local demands. Nonetheless, we accept that we are interconnected, and it's evident that the winds, the cold winds that flow from New York or London have an effect, even in places like Russia, who would rather that were the case. So I'm quite convinced by those two examples that we have hit on a rich seam here, and I hope that we can continue to mine it and also continue to make quite practical contributions. And I think what we do need to think probably more about as we take this network forward is the dissemination dimension of what we do, how we communicate the thinking that emerges in conferences like this. One important dimension of that communication, however, we have already agreed on, and that is in the form of the new Journal on Global Policy, which is advertised outside, which will be hosted at the LSE, but which we very much see as emanating from this network with very strong partnerships embedded in the journal with the other partners in the GPPA. Patrick Dunleavy is going to say more about the journal, the sorts of things we're looking for, the ambitions we have tomorrow at late afternoon. We're not all going to be perhaps will be there then, so I wanted to mention that and encourage you to take away the materials about it and think about the ways in which your institutions might be able to contribute to these debates through the medium of the journal. So I'm very encouraged from an LSE point of view about how this is going. Very grateful to PKU for hosting this third event in these splendid facilities. Also, in anticipation, I thank them for their dinner this evening, the confident expectation that it will be good. And with that, let me hand over to Michel.
Thank you, Lloyd. It's always difficult to take the floor after audit, so I can be only brief. Yes, what we have learned from the last year is that the social sciences have a future in a world when we invest so much in research, excellent research, but usually the real hard ones. We rediscover that the utmost important topics are how can we live together? Do we have values in common? Or can we live in separate sets of values? That's the question. And at least there's a debate. At least we must work hard to understand ourselves and to avoid any real hard conflict. Secondly, speaking of global warming, sustainable development, not only how can we live together, the question is how can we survive on our planet? How could the planet survive? That's two examples of why faculty, the students of course, and universities like ours must invest deeply and very fast in those social sciences, in humanities, two fields of smartness, field of research that are always been at the core of omnidisciplinary universities. But with the progress of science and research, it seems that some governments, perhaps some private companies, perhaps some students, have forgotten that the profound philosophy that makes humanity are also at the center of universities. So yes, thank you to the organizers. Thank you for these excellent debates. We have all very busy diaries, so anytime we use 1 or 2 days, it's extremely appreciable to be happy at the end of the day, even if it's a hard day. And yes, have a good dinner. Thank you.
Say that I agree with the two colleagues, and I'm here on behalf of the provost of Columbia University, Alan Brinkley, who can't make it this time. He actually was in Beijing not that long ago, and also our dean, the SIPA School of International Public Affairs, Dean John Cosworth. To just say that to thank our host, Beijing School of the PKU School of Government, and for such excellent hosting this event. And we just had the first day, and which is very substantial. We have a lot of debates, even though we don't necessarily have to draw all conclusions on global governance, on international, global financial structure, on the environmental and climate change issues, on values. So, but I think it's important for this kind of debate to be played out. And as public policy schools, we played a unique role in all these issues. I think we continue to do that. And Columbia's, want to reaffirm its commitment to this network, GPPN, and we're looking forward to host this sometime down the road. I know that's probably coming to our turn or LSE's turn next time. We just recently, just by way of advertising, recently the university decided to set up a series of a network of international centers, global centers around the world, as part of globalization of higher education. And Columbia trying to make an effort in that. And the first center is in Beijing, which I will head, and also we have several others in planning, including a center in Jordan, and maybe one in Bombay, India, and maybe in Africa. So this is all in our planning, and shows our commitment to the global sort of education, internationalization of education. Thank you very much, and is it supposed to be end of the day? Thank you very much.
Thank you.